Once again, welcome. I'm Kim Todd with the World Trade Center, Northern California, here in Sacramento. I am the manager of international programs and events for the organization. Our organization strives to create a more economically vibrant and globally fluent region by providing resources, education, and connections. And one of the ways that we accomplish this goal is our work through the State Department's premier citizen diplomacy program, known as the International Visitor Leadership Program. And through this program, we have the great honor and privilege of hosting international visitors who are emerging leaders throughout the world. We get to plan programs and introduce them to their American counterparts here in the US and make these important lasting connections, provide the opportunity for folks to share ideas, best practices, and learn from each other. The combined office with Sacramento and our Global Ties San Francisco office, on an average year, we see approximately 1,000 international visitors on an annual basis. Obviously, COVID has impacted our ability to see people in person and face-to-face. We feel very lucky that we get the opportunity to still connect virtually. We're very happy that you guys have joined us to kind of continue that ability to connect people and to learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Alana Crandall from San Francisco, who will introduce this Global Perspective series that we are launching and introduce the panelists as well.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining today. Yes, we have launched, this is the launching webinar of our new Global Perspective series, which is based on us trying to gain global perspectives on certain key issues that we're all facing around the world. And one of those major issues right now is information in the digital age, and how information is being interpreted or misinterpreted, or issues we're all very familiar with these days, like misinformation and disinformation, but also some other things to consider about our new information system and how information flows in this system, and our state of heightened interconnectivity and what that means for journalism and what that means for consumers. So we are releasing this new 3-part series called Information in the Digital Age, and this is addressing all of these issues. And later in the episode, later in the series, we'll be discussing more detail, things like disinformation campaigns by state and non-state actors, cybersecurity, and also how consumers can be more media literate. This first episode is focusing on how journalism has been impacted by the digital age, how journalists have adapted to this changing world. It's all of the breaking news. We find ourselves in these situations wherein there's such a rush to be the first to break news that sometimes, I wouldn't say journalism ethics falls to the wayside, but there are some issues that arise with this. And so this is what some of our panelists are going to be discussing today. Let's see here. So we have 3 distinguished panelists that we're very excited to have on today. Our first panelist is Stuart Leavenworth, and he is the editor for the Los Angeles Times. He has also been a reporter at the Beijing bureau chief for McClatchy News. He is going to be addressing issues related to how technology has impacted journalism, especially from his view from the Los Angeles Times and elsewhere and over time, and having that global perspective of his work in Beijing and throughout his career. So we're very excited to have him on. In addition, our second panelist is Molly Dugan. She is a professor of journalism at Sacramento State University and of journalism and communication studies, where she teaches upper-level classes in public affairs reporting and news writing. She also teaches journalism classes on media literacy, diversity, and social justice in mass communication. Molly is going to be speaking today about, let's see here, she's going to be speaking today about changes with government and journalism, best practices, and how the digital age of heightened interconnectivity and constant access to information has impacted which stories are told. She'll also partially be touching upon journalism ethics. And our final speaker and panelist for today is Giovanni Zagni. Giovanni is the director of Pagella Politica, the only Italian fact-checking project entirely devoted to politicians' claims, and of Facta, a fact-checking project focused on online disinformation. He is a journalist and a member of the monitoring unit on disinformation around COVID-19, established by the Italian government in April 2020, as well as a member of the technical table on pluralism and correctness of information, established by the Italian Authority for Communications. He is also a IVLP alumnus. He participated in the IVLP program this time last year on a project on journalism and disinformation. And he's going to be speaking today about the role of fact-checking in journalism as part of this ongoing transformation of the media environment, and how fact-checking tries to have an impact on this extreme velocity of the current news cycle. So it will first be Stuart, and then Molly, and then Giovanni, and we will wrap it up with questions. So on to you, Stuart, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I've been given 10 minutes to talk about how technology has changed journalism. So no problem, I got this. And after that, in 20 minutes, I will describe the history of the world as we know it. No, more seriously, thank you for being here. And I just wanted to clarify something. Alana was very generous in her introduction. I am not the editor of the Los Angeles Times. I'm an editor there. I supervise reporters who in Sacramento and the Bay Area, and reporters doing kind of statewide coverage. So I'm going to talk about three things. How technology has changed how we report the news, how it's changed our business model, and how it's changed how governments interact with journalists. When I started in newspapers in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, I got a job as an environmental reporter at the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina, which had a very progressive, smart local ownership that was very interested in the internet, which was a whole new thing at that time in the early 90s. And it really, in a matter of years, transformed how we reported in that newsroom. We had the best technology, the best Apple MacBooks, and we had a whole crew that was devoted to database reporting. And that really was transformative, as was the search engines that we could use for the first time to research our stories and do it very quickly. But even back then, I don't think any of us imagined that the internet would be the way we deliver news the way we do now. I mean, we never thought it would transform almost everything about how we do our work. I will say it hasn't changed everything. I mean, the basics of journalism are still there: to ask questions, to hold public officials accountable. Many things have not changed, but it is really pretty revolutionary what has happened in just a short period in the last 20 years. And it makes me think about just what the next 5 or 10 years are going to be like for journalism. It's hard to imagine. Obviously, as Alana mentioned, one of the big changes is that, you know, we're no longer just writing stories to be published in the next day's paper. We're digital first, as they say, and that has changed many things. I think it's obviously put a premium on being first on the story and being able to send out those push alerts when we have the story first. And that obviously is dangerous. There's such intense competition to get that story first. You can get facts wrong, you can put up a misleading headline, or you can just put out a bunch of stupid typos in a quickly written story. But the other thing that's changed, I think, is there's also more of a premium on scoops, on getting a story, a really smart story, before anybody gets to it. And so that's been, I think, a good thing. I think that that has forced journalists to really kind of dig a little bit more and try to go into areas that nobody else has gone into. The other thing, obviously, that's changed with technology is just the business model of how we operate. I remember back when newspapers had these big sections called classified ads. That was a major part of the revenue for most newspapers. Then came this thing called Craigslist. And wow, in a matter of years, that just wiped out a source of revenue for newspapers. I mean, that was a source of revenue that newspapers had exclusively. It wasn't like TV or anybody else was doing classified ads. But when Craigslist came along, it really put a big dent in our revenues. And obviously, as you all know, Facebook has, gobbled up digital advertising revenues. So as print circulation has decreased, as print advertising has decreased, most media have not been able to replace that with any kind of digital advertising revenue. What's happened more recently is that major media companies, former newspaper companies or currently newspaper companies like the LA Times, we've been putting up paywalls so that, and trying to work to get people to buy digital subscriptions. So that has been somewhat successful. It's been more successful for, let's say, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal than for a lot of papers. But it has been successful for us at the LA Times, and especially during this pandemic. We've been hit hard by a loss of print advertising because so many businesses in LA are not in business. But we've seen a huge increase in our digital subscriptions in just a matter of months. And so a lot of the things that we do, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what stories are people signing up for? What are the ones that are making them want to pay for the product? And what do we do to get them to continue to pay for that product? So there's so much more time spent on all these analytics. And there's a lot of divisions within our newsroom on that emphasis. I think a lot of us would just like to focus on the journalism, to get the good stories, just to do, the work we're trained to do and not spend a lot of time trying to analyze, how many subscribers clicked on this story or how many people bought subscriptions for that story. But it's the reality of where we are now. And it's hard to know, what the future holds for local journalism. And I'm sure Molly will talk a little bit more about this, but it's really quite scary what's going on. It's pretty clear that there are major news operations like the New York Times and Washington Post are going to survive all this, and they're going to figure out a way to make money off journalism. But there's a whole bunch of local operations that are not going to survive. And so what is going to happen to the kind of accountability that journalists brought to those local communities? Lastly, my stopwatch stopped. Oh, I've got 3 minutes. There's been a dramatic change in how government officials deal with journalists in this digital age. Here in the US, the most obvious stuff you see is that elected leaders don't really want to interact with the press and don't necessarily have to communicate to their constituents. So they're using Twitter and they're using, press releases, and they're not holding press conferences the way they did. They're not making themselves available the way they used to. And that creates challenges for us. In the digital age, we have some new tools. Government officials send emails. We can FOIA those. We can try to get at that kind of stuff, try to, dig in there. But oftentimes, especially in this pandemic, we're having trouble getting those FOIAs returned, getting a sense of what's going on in real time, which is so important right now. So, maybe 3 months from now, they'll respond to our FOIAs about, Governor Newsom and his decision-making on this pandemic, but we won't be able to tell you that in real time because it's pretty easy now for public officials to just, control their own messaging through social media. The other thing that's changed kind of on an international scale, which is quite disturbing, is government's use of technology to surveil on journalists and to block them from doing what they would do. And, you know, I was in Beijing for 3 years from 2014, 2016. And, you know, it was pretty much what I expected and not. Basically, you know, the whole time I was there, I was assuming I was being monitored in some form, you know, my phone communications, my internet communications. China has this great firewall that would prevent us from using Google or social media. We would get around that with a VPN. But there was like cameras everywhere, and it was very, very difficult to figure out a safe way to set up meetings with sources or do interviews. I can recall several times in China, I would be extremely careful in trying to set up a meeting with somebody in a city that was sensitive because there was some kind of unrest going on. And I would arrive at that meeting and all of a sudden there were these plainclothes cops everywhere. So this is not unique to China. There's governments around the world that are using technology to try to prevent journalists from doing their jobs. And even more disturbing since I've left is that China is starting to use face recognition technology. And so that means that they have an extra tool to keep track of not just journalists, but some of the people that want to talk to journalists and end up oftentimes getting sent to jail for doing so. So that's kind of the reality we face. I'd like to think that as technology advances, it'll provide benefits for journalists as it has in the past, but there will also be some downsides, some serious downsides that I don't think we can even foresee at this point. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to answering questions from some of you later.
And Molly, if you'd like to start with your section. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Sure. Good morning. It's nice to see so many names out there. I wish we were all able to be together in person. I'd like to basically reflect on what Stuart just said. And one of the things as I was listening to him, I think it's really demonstrative of something that's happening in journalism right now. That is of time.
We'll see if she regains. Molly, you there? Some technological difficulties.
Yes.
Okay, let's hope she comes back.
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry about that. It was probably my internet. But what I was saying is that Stuart was really reflective of the idea that we exist in the best of times and the worst of times. You're seeing some fantastic investigative journalism being produced, and a lot of that is because of the technological abilities that we have now. We can have access to data that shed light on important issues. For instance, the local newspaper in Sacramento not too long ago overlaid zip codes with health records to determine where in the community infant mortality rates were the highest, and the racial and the economic backgrounds of those most affected to demonstrate those kinds of inequities. We now have the data to be able to do that. We can include, there are more and more voices in news stories now, thanks in part to social media and being able to reach out. Journalists can reach out to different communities. You're seeing really, and frankly, and part of this is, you know, really just emerging with some of the crisis that we've been having in the last couple of years, is a really rethinking of the possibilities of journalism and our role, not just domestically, but internationally as well. We're seeing young people who are really enthusiastic about journalism, and there are record-breaking numbers of journalism students in colleges in the US. And a lot of them are looking to start their own outlets, and they're looking to to do investigative reporting. So there's a lot to, and then of course we have new fact-checking resources, which I know Giovanni's going to talk about as well. So there's a lot to be really optimistic about. At the same time, we cannot deny that there's a lot of bad news. We have a crisis in local news. A lot of communities are losing their local newspapers, and local newspapers are being purchased by hedge funds, which are just bleeding them dry, which means that there are fewer reporters, which means that there's more clickbait. You have, and then you also, so we have kind of a good news, bad news scenario here. But one of the things that I find really interesting right now, and I just realized that I forgot to set my timer, so I'm going to set it to about 7 minutes. 7 minutes, and see. I think that's a good estimate.
We're keeping track of you too, so we'll let you know.
I think one of the things right now, in addition to the changing technological platforms, we also have a changing political and social landscape that is forcing journalists to reconsider our best practices. So, for instance, there are 5 questions I think that journalists are really asking themselves right now. One is, how do we create a balance, which has often been a two-sided balance, the right, the left, conservatives, liberals, etc. Does that balance really work in today's environment where things are so much more complicated? Does that work when we have leaders all over the world who lie and who hide things? Does a two-sided balance work when we're in that situation, or when we're in a situation where there are people that are promoting hateful ideologies? Does that work anymore? What does balance really mean in this environment that, for so many years journalists have looked at balance as being something really binary, and now we're looking at something that's we're rethinking that. The other thing that I think journalists are rethinking is, how are the stories that we write reflective of the concerns of the entire community? So I think journalism is really looking at trying to be more inclusive and really having a conversation with itself about people in the community, particularly people of color who have felt left out, who see stories produced by their local news outlet that aren't particularly reflective of their experiences. And journalists are working on that. And that's one thing that's really great about journalism, is journalists tend to be very self-reflective. When I ask my students why they want to go into journalism, with the exception of those who are interested in sports journalism because they love sports, almost 90% of them say it's really because they want to make the world a better place. And so I think that comes out in this sort of self-reflection. And so that's what we're looking at now. Are we writing stories that are reflective of the entire community? I think the other part of that is looking at who and what we are including in our stories. That, I think, to some degree, is a result of the 2016 presidential election. Are we giving too much attention to one side because they're noisier? What really matters? What should we really be reporting on when there's an endless number of things to report on? How much coverage should we be giving one person? I think the fourth thing that we're reconsidering right now is how we maintain impartiality and independence in a politically divisive climate. Journalists are increasingly accused of and asked to take sides. And the idea I had, my first editor told me, you should never be happy if one side is happy with you. You should only be happy if both sides are angry. And I think that but it can be very difficult for journalists to balance that when it's important to be impartial and independent, but the climate is making that really, really difficult for us to do. And fifth, I think the other kind of practice that we're really looking at is, how do we educate the public and future journalists, but mostly the public, about the difference between opinion and genuine inquiry. Journalism has a public relations problem. It's important for us to engage in really educating the community about what it is that makes quality journalism, what it is that is fake news, as you all will be doing in another session. So those are some of the more kind of philosophical things that journalists are tussling with. And I think that they have been working with those for a long time. Technology and the change in journalism financial model, I think, prompted some of those inquiries. I think the use of technology prompted some of those. And frankly, I think the last 6 months have prompted some of those with the crisis that we have from the COVID-19 pandemic, the BLM protests, and the recognition that maybe newsrooms are not the most diverse places, and that journalism needs to work on being more inclusive. You have, again, leaders not, all around the world that are lying and obfuscating and hiding things, and as Stuart said, monitoring journalists. So it's a multi-fronted battle in a lot of ways. But again, I mean, I think that despite all of these conditions, there's some fantastic journalism being produced. And I'm actually going to put in the chat, for those of you that are interested, there's a media bias chart that comes out every so often that looks at different media outlets and where they fall, and they use analytics to do this. And so I'll go ahead and post that in the chat. But that leads me to the idea of those changing technologies and, the 3 major benefits, that we can reach those new sources. We can make it more equitable. We can have more voices because of social media and that we otherwise wouldn't have. We have access to data that sheds light on important issues, and I gave you an example. And of course, we also have access to a lot of fact-checking resources. And I really appreciate the groups like the one that Giovanni works with, because oftentimes they're journalists, but they also help other journalists with their fact-checking too, and help guide us. And that's incredibly valuable as well. So with that, I'm really looking forward to your questions. I apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, and I'm really interested to hear from all of you.
Thank you so much, Molly. Giovanni?
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. Good evening. I said good evening, yeah, because here in Milan it's 7 p.m. So yeah, but I know it's morning for you. So the thing that I'm going to talk about is kind of finding the answer to this pretty simple question. So where does fact-checking square in all the things that we have heard today, and what's the situation of fact-checking in the current media environment? So I would answer saying that the situation, to use a kind of a weird metaphor, fact-checking is like a panda, because it has a lot of attention. A lot of people talk about it, either because it's trendy or because fact-checking has its critics. But finally, nobody is really sure how fact-checking can actually stay alive today. Because as you know, pandas can just eat a couple of kinds of bamboos, and they kind of mate once a year per year. So they're kind of this weird thing that nobody knows why is still alive in today's ecosystem. And fact-checking is similar to that, if you think about it, because for one, fact-checking is extremely slow, where the news cycle is super fast. As Stuart was saying, we are immersed into this environment that looks for things that are extremely quick, and you have to insert yourself into this cycle, while fact-checking tends to arrive later. Fact-checking is always late. And on the other hand, and that's also something that Stuart pointed out, fact-checking never breaks news. Fact-checking, while the current media environment craves for breaking news, craves for big news, original reporting. And fact-checking is almost by definition not original. It builds on something that is already out there. Now, one of the most important things that I would like to say about fact-checking and how it squares into all this discussion is that even if it is not so thought about, fact-checking is actually two very different things. One, and you can summarize it if you think about in the American world, in the difference between Snopes and PolitiFact. So they do clearly two very different jobs, even if you can put them both under the label of fact-checking, maybe Snopes under debunking too, but also PolitiFact is starting to do something similar to debunking. So actually they do some very different things. They are different in this kind of two kinds of fact-checking are different, for example, in the object of what they talk about. So for example, political fact-checking, like PolitiFact is famous for doing, takes up a claim made by a politician. For example, I'll take some example from the Italian political world. A politician said a couple of days ago, thanks to our government, today there are 1.7 million families out of poverty in Italy. So this is something that clearly you can check using experts, official data, official statistics, and that kind of things. While on the other hand, one fake news that we debunked is something like the woman in this photo gave birth to a child at the age of 54, which is kind of one of these recurring hoaxes and fake images that travel around. And this is something that you cannot clearly debunk with the same tools. So it is not something that has to do with statistical databases or experts in economics, but with, I don't know, reverse image search or tools that tell you if a photo was manipulated. And also, finally, these two kinds of fact-checking have two very different audiences. One is, of course, people that are interested in politics. Not everyone is interested in politics, right? And you need to have people in order to read a long PolitiFact article that are willing and also able to engage with a long and complex explanation of why this political claim is true or not. While on the other hand, you can very well summarize the audience of the non-political fact-checking or the debunking as something like a parent of yours that is not so media savvy and not so smart with a computer, let's say your grandmother. So clearly they have a totally different attitude toward the fact-checking articles. And finally, they are two audiences that slightly, it is rare that they overlap. Now, it happens that these two kinds of fact-checking, which are pretty different, as I hope I've shown, it happens that they occasionally overlap. And when do they overlap? They overlap when a big media outlet, I won't make any American analogy here, or a big and very important politician, and I won't make any example either, take a completely false thing that comes from the, say, non-political fact-checking world, or the false memes or the outlandish claims, and spreads it to the contacts that he can, to the audience that he can reach, because he or she or the media outlet, usually they have these huge audiences at ease that they can easily reach. And so in this, so they act, to make a coronavirus analogy, as kind of super spreaders of this disinformation. And this is not something that I'm telling you from Milan, which could also sound like not particularly credible, but it is also one of the conclusions of a very interesting research from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism that published a paper on this a few weeks ago. So one of the other things that comes out from this discussion is that fact-checking has not only two different things, but on top of that, has also shifted in the past few years from one meaning to the other, mainly. So a few years ago, so around 2015 or 14, so to say, fact-checking was mainly political fact-checking, was mainly political fact-checking claims about the president. But in the past few years, after 2016, when this huge term fake news kind of crashed into the political discourse and the public discourse, then fact-checking started to mean more and more the second thing. So the thing that had to do with non-political, with memes, with things that were viral on social media and in our media diet, so to say. So one of the biggest questions that I don't have an answer to, listening to the speakers that spoke before me, is this one. So if fact-checking is relevant today, does it have an impact, or even can it have an impact in today's media environment, when we can see that, as I said, it is low where the news cycle is fast, and it never breaks news where the media environment craves for breaking news and for original report. Now, I don't have an answer to that, and this is something that I just put out for the discussion, but I think that on one hand, we tend to ask too much from fact-checking. We tend to ask from fact-checking that it solves all the problems that we have in the disinformation department, especially from the general public. They tend to think that if there is fact-checking out there, then there will be no more disinformation. And I think that is kind of too much, because I mean, usually, especially in Italy and in Europe more generally, or at least in many countries in Europe, fact-checking projects tend to be very small. They have few people, not many people in it. They tend to be not to have a huge budget. They tend to be very young and also very recent in their establishment. But so what they can do, the audience that they can reach is kind of limited because of that. And for some reason, for example, in Italy, there is a huge resistance from the mainstream media to adopt the language and the kind of journalism that fact-checking is. I think that some of that has to do with the fact that, at least in Italy, median age at the newspaper is kind of high. So people are not so accustomed to these new things and tend to think that fact-checking is something that those young nerds do. And for that reason, it has kind of a limited spread in the media environment. And on the other hand, I think that fact-checking could still be useful if we think of it as just another form in which good explanatory journalism is presented to the public. So I think mainly in the work that I do through Pagella Politica and Facta, as a place where people interested in the themes of today's political world can find a place where those themes are kind of explained and put into a context for readers that are willing to know more about that. So I see fact-checking more as one particular kind of language that you use and some way suited you dress in order to present a content that otherwise is very well already present in the media media environment. So I'm not sure if fact-checking is the solution for anything, or even if it will be still here in 5 or 10 years, because it could be that you know, it is not friendly anymore and just it dissolves somewhere. But in the end, we don't know if pandas will be here in a decade or so, and so I leave that to this kind of general doubt for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Kim?
Great, thank you so much to all the panelists for your thoughts and viewpoints on this topic, which, as Stuart mentioned, it's rather huge, and it can go many directions. Shameless plug, that's why we are doing a 3-part series. So the other 2 series will dive a little bit more into some of the topics that we just glazed over here. There are some questions that have come through. I may not go in order that they're listed. I just wanted to highlight a question that came through that I think it would be great to get everybody's viewpoint on. When did fact-checking stop being the responsibility of a journalist? So I think maybe if all the panelists can address that, and we know that local journalists do a great job, and they do their investigations and they do their best to fact check. So there might need to be a little bit more explanation on what fact checking is from the responsibility of a journalist versus, you know, the information that's being put out there.
I think we might have had a little bit of confusion in terms of verbiage, and which happens, you know, a lot in this field. Journalists certainly do fact check their work. Absolutely. I mean, we're going out there to try to get the most accurate information possible. Fact checkers, as Giovanni was talking about, oftentimes, at least in the United States, and I'm not sure so much how it works in Italy, there are various groups that what they do is they will fact check like a politician's statement or a campaign ad, and they will go through and find different pieces of it, and then oftentimes work with the journalists to do a story that shows what really happened. But generally, I mean, journalists are still fact-checking. I don't want anybody to leave with the impression that we have fact-checkers and we have journalists, but that oftentimes when there is a fact-checking project, journalists will report on that and they will work together on that. I don't know, Stuart, you wanted to?
Yeah, every story we do is pretty closely fact-checked, both by reporter, editor, copy editor, and you know, one of the instructions I learned early on in my career is usually when you make a mistake, you misspell somebody's name, you mess up a date, you do some bad math. So those are the things we really closely check. And if we get something wrong, we publish a correction. And that's one of the great things I think about at least newspaper journalism, is that we're very attentive to making sure we correct the record.
Well, from my perspective, the only thing I could add is that, well, one is that in Italy, this kind of fact-checking of the articles doesn't happen so, I mean, so thoroughly, especially in online media. And one of the big problems here is that when you have to publish, and it happens also in major newspapers here in Italy, when you have to publish like a dozen articles per day, and you have to publish them into a kind of 6-hour time span, then you tend to have the attitude, I'll publish this short piece, and then we'll see if it is 100% correct. So if we think of fact-checking as the moment when you check the information in an article, which is, as Molly was saying, is kind of different from what I actually do and what my project does, then the problem of how fast the media environment is and how quick you have to produce articles in online newspapers is kind of one of the most important ones.
Great, thank you so much for that clarification. Another question that came through is, what do you believe it will take for local news to survive the digital age? Obviously, you know, the business model has been upended, and local newsrooms have had to cut staff, but they are doing such an important job of bringing community stories of interest to the public's awareness. So we'd love to get your insight into what you think it will take.
I'll start. It's not an easy answer. It's there's probably not one single thing that needs to be done. I mean, it's not, you can't rely on one single thing to help local news survive. But I think it'll take a combination of things. I think it will be the responsibility of local news operations to reflect their community. And we're not always doing a great job of that. We're not as diverse as we should be in certain communities. And if we want to gain the public's trust and urge them to subscribe to our product, we have to do a better job on reflecting on communities. Secondly, I think consumers of news have to be willing to pay for it. I mean, people pay for cable TV, but are often reluctant to pay to get accurately reported news about their community. So I think that has to change as well. Lastly, it's clear there's going to have to be new business models. And so you're seeing around the country philanthropy stepping in and basically keeping news alive. And this is good and bad. Sometimes the philanthropists have their own agendas and they want to be owning a newspaper or a news operation so that they can push that agenda. And sometimes it's more nebulous, like Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post. Maybe he's a hands-off owner, I don't know, but anyway, that seems to be one of the potential models out there. Molly and Giovanni, you want to add?
Sure, I'll add. I keep hoping that in journalism there's a magic financial model that emerges, you know, like a magic vaccine that we're all hoping for, right? That's 100% effective. But I think that Stuart is absolutely right. And I would just amplify everything that he said. I agree with him 100% on all of the different things it's going to take. I can break it down into two things. We need the public to buy in and to understand the importance of local news. And I would like that to happen before local news goes away, because I think it'll become very, very apparent why local news is so important when it's no longer there. When there's a crisis and you don't have anybody there to really cover it in a thorough way. I don't want that to happen before people recognize the importance of local news. So we really need public buy-in. We need to educate the public. And then I also think that we need we need to be continuing to look at creative ways, both in how to use technology, different financial models that might work. The financial model of the news industry was largely unchanged for 150 years and up until about 15 years ago. And there's a lot of interesting things that are happening, as Stuart pointed out, with philanthropic groups, nonprofit groups. But really, to make local news thrive, we need to figure out a way for it to really make money in a commercial environment. And I hope that happens before we lose it.
Well, I'll just add that, I mean, I think local news have one big advantage, that they tend to have a community that is pretty clear because it's geographically defined and also not huge usually. And you don't have, if you think about newspaper, you don't have like 24 of them in a medium range city. So I think that they have this advantage of having an audience kind of by default. So the thing that they have to do is to be relevant for that community. So you have to find and report stories that people know that if they go to the newsstand or whatever they get their newspaper or online, they'll find something that they help you live in their community. They they'll find stories about their community that otherwise they won't know. Or if everybody in a community is talking about a story, they know that in the newspaper they can really know something more about it. And I see that very strongly in my small town. My hometown is like 2 hours by train from Milan. And there, I mean, you could do without the national newspaper, but you have to read the local one, because otherwise you really won't know what's going on in the city. So it is still the answer to a need. And to be, I mean, I don't want to sound brutal in it, but in a commercial environment, you have to answer to a need from the audience. Otherwise, it's difficult that you can stay there just because it's not that cities or communities must have a local newspaper by default. In some ways, local media have to earn that privilege. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. We have some great questions coming through. And I know we're kind of running short on time. I might do just one more. Some of the questions that have come through also could kind of tie in to part 2 of our series, a little bit more on media literacy and the impact of social media and things like that. So I may take these questions and we can kind of work those into the next session. What I would like to do now is ask this one. Cambridge Analytica, a tech giant in the UK, has been accused of technology and data analytics to influence voters' perceptions and their choices in elections. What do you think the media and journalists can do to help safeguard democracy against these analytics? And Stuart, you mentioned that analytics are helpful on some level to understand what stories to present, but if they're being used as a way to manipulate information, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a great question and a really important one. I think the main thing that newsrooms need to do is to devote a reporter to kind of covering this kind of manipulation of democracy and this use of technology to try to influence elections. So, and I mean, that requires, you know, hiring reporters who really are well sourced in the tech world and in the national security world, and you know, and also kind of aware that it's not just Cambridge Analytica, but it's often foreign actors, you know, so that takes a pretty sizable investment. You know, you need to get people that are really very well connected, well trained, and you probably need more than just one reporter in your newsroom to really dog that when we get to election time.
You know, I have a really kind of simple answer to it and a very unsatisfying answer, I'm sure. And that is, people who regularly read the news don't get manipulated through these sort of, through these social media channels. And so my unsatisfying answer, in addition to, once again, agreeing with Stuart's response about doing a better job of explaining it to the public, is frankly getting the public to read our election coverage, because those who are really well informed through reliable outlets can see that more. The good news in all of this is that the Pew Research Center, which does some really amazing studies and surveys, did a survey and found that people who are between the ages of 18 and 30 are much more likely to be able to find when something is phony, false, when it's opinion that's trying to pretend it's fact. So one of the good pieces of information is that I think younger people aren't falling for it as much. Now we just need to get them to go out and vote.
Well, I think that Cambridge Analytica is kind of a success story because because it was Facebook stopped doing those things because the Cambridge Analytica scandal came out, and that was because there was great reporting on it. So that kind of practices were stopped because journalism was able to find out that story and report well on it. So I think that journalism actually, if it is very good journalism, is kind of the antidote for that. And those kind of things are not happening today, for example, because there was great reporting on it.
I think
That's
that's
great
excellent.
perspective.
Yes, we're so excited to have everybody here. This was a wonderful discussion. I know Kim is just about to jump into because we were 1 minute to the end. But I just wanted to say thank you to our 3 distinguished panelists, and thank you to the whole audience and everybody who attended. This was a great first session in our new 3-part series. And a lot of the issues that we have discussed today do tie into future discussions we will be having later in the month and next month about, media literacy for consumers and what consumers can do to address these issues. And then for disinformation, we will be discussing computational propaganda, social media bots, different issues related to cybersecurity. And I hope this was beneficial for you all, and I hope you join us next time. More information to come.
Thank you so much.